Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Today, we're going to talk about what it means to drive safely in an age of automation. So first, let's ask ourselves, what do we think our future with automated vehicles is going to look like? The introduction of the automobile originally was quite chaotic. Roads at that time were for pedestrians, were for horse-drawn carriages, were for bicyclists. They weren't for these loud, horseless carriages. So what will happen when we introduce automated vehicles? So think about this. What if every automated vehicle on the road had its own definition of what it thought was the right thing to do when it comes to driving safely? What if every state in the country or country in Europe had its own definition of driving safely? What if every time there was an accident involving an automated vehicle, it resulted in a lawsuit to decide who in fact was driving safely and who was not? But this is the current state of affairs in the industry today. And so the point here is that unless we can come to an agreement on what it means for an automated vehicle to drive safely, there likely will not be automated vehicles. Or at the very least, they're going to be deployed on a much more limited basis because of these open questions. And so this is the role of safety standards then. And so you might think, why are safety standards necessary? Well, let's look to an adjacent industry. Let's look at aerospace. When automation technologies were being introduced into aircraft in the early 90s, there started to be safety incidents. Pilots were confused about the capabilities of the automation system. It worked differently across different manufacturers. And so for the first time ever, the FAA created a new kind of team, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, or CAST. And their role was not to look at crashes that happen and figure out why it happened and then issue regulations to fix it. It's to proactively identify in advance of the deployment of an automation technology and understand what are the possible risks and how can those risks be mitigated. So with this change, we saw one of the safest periods of air travel in the history of the industry. But it took the FAA bringing companies together and thinking about an understanding what is risk, defining it and assessing it prior to deployment so that we can make sure that we have an acceptable level of risk for these products when they're deployed. And so how are we doing in the automotive industry? I think we all know the numbers. They speak for themselves. Today we have 100 people dying every year because of other humans behind the wheel. But even if we were to improve that by 100x, and let's say we have only 360 folks dying every year, if it was automation drivers behind the wheel, that's probably a front page headline. And so this kind of gets us to this question, right, of how safe is safe enough? And here's the opportunity that we have. Just like the FAA did, we have an opportunity for the first time in history to proactively set the level of safety that we desire for these machines. But in order to do that, we need to come together and understand, what does driving safely mean? And that's where we propose. Driving safely is driving at a societally acceptable risk balance and proving that you're doing so. So first, let's consider, how do machines and humans differ? As humans, we learn tricks. We have tricks like the 2-second rule, where we're following another vehicle and we count the number of seconds after the vehicle in front passes some marker to when that same marker hits the front of our vehicle. And so this is a trick. It's a rule that we have. A lot of times it's wrong. A lot of times we need more than 2 seconds. Sometimes it's overly conservative and we could follow more closely if we wanted to. But the thing is, with automated vehicles, we don't need to guess. We have a better way. This is a formula based on the responsibility sensitive safety model that's really just physics. We have objects of mass in motion here, and we don't want them to collide. And so from Newtonian physics, we know that if you take the velocity of each of those objects, you take their deceleration rates, you take things like the reaction time, you can calculate very precisely what is a sufficiently distance between these two objects so that the vehicle in the rear can avoid crashing into the vehicle in front if the vehicle in front were to suddenly brake. Simple, right? But there's a trick to this though. So not all of these parameters can be measured or known. So you don't need to know what all of these are, but one of these, beta max, represents an assumption about what is a reasonable and foreseeable expectation on the deceleration rate of that vehicle that I'm following. And this is not a trivial question, Because if we look at different cars on the road, we have significantly different performance. If there's a high-end sports car on the road, you're likely to have a vehicle that could brake at 12 and a half meters per second squared. If you've got a larger truck, a bit less. But interestingly, NHTSA found in their own research that it doesn't matter what kind of vehicle a human is driving. Humans, because of our own physical capabilities, we brake with about 6.5 meters per second squared. So when trying to calculate a safe following distance, what value should we use? Should we assume a theoretical worst case of 12.5 meters per second, or maybe it's actually 20 or 30 meters per second because somebody's got an advanced race car on the road? Well, if we do that, what's going to happen? We're going to have longer following distances. We're going to have vehicles that annoy everyone else on the road. And we're going to have a vehicle that contributes negatively to traffic flows, causing traffic jams. And, consumers will get sick and tired of these driverless vehicles in very short order. But it's a very safe vehicle, right? Because we've chosen that global theoretical worst case. On the other hand, if we choose something more naturalistic, say 8 meters per second squared or 9 meters per second squared, we're going to get into a vehicle that's still much safer than human drivers, but there's a non-zero chance now that we could get into a crash if the vehicle in front decelerates at a rate greater than that value used. So what should we pick? What value? And this is the thing. Driving is essentially a balance between safety and usefulness. And this is where industry and government have different roles. So industry's role here is to define these parameters that govern what it means to drive safely. Government's role is to pick the values. And actually, government does this all the time. When a new road is built, a speed limit is selected. That value for that speed limit parameter represents acceptable risk for that roadway. And so if the government wanted to eliminate all injury accidents overnight around the country, around the world, we could set the global maximum speed limit to be 5 miles per hour. It would be incredible for safety, right? So why wouldn't we do it? Well, because of the loss of efficiency and utility of our transportation network. There are other regulations coming around electric vehicles that will require electric vehicles to emit a sound when operating below certain speeds. This is to help us hear them coming so they don't kind of creep up on us from behind. And so in this case, the government said 62 decibels. That's the number. Okay, well, why wasn't it 63? Why not 70? Wouldn't 80 or 90 decibels be better for safety? Sure, but at what cost? Our hearing and annoying other people on the road. But why was it 62? Why wasn't it 60 or 50? I don't know. But the point is, the government went through a process, did some research, and picked a value that represents acceptable risk. And so must we also do for automated vehicles. And so fortunately, there's a standard here to help. IEEE P2846 is a standard titled Assumptions for Models and Safety-Related Automated Vehicle Behavior. We have an incredible collection of entities that are contributing to this standard. And in this standard, we are standardizing for the industry what are the assumptions that automated vehicles need to make about other road users that govern this behavior that's going to ultimately lead to performance and so-called driving safely on the road. So in that simple car following scenario, what is the assumption that matters? We already talked about it. What is the maximum assumed longitudinal deceleration? For pedestrians, they have more advanced kinematic properties. And so for a pedestrian, sure, we have longitudinal velocity. We also have acceleration. What if a pedestrian is occluded? What should I assume is their maximum acceleration from behind that occlusion? That's important to know as I'm navigating around that occlusion. We also have heading angle. If a pedestrian is on the sidewalk, we generally expect they're going to stay on the sidewalk for us as a human driver. But why do we expect that? Well, intuitively, it boils down to physics, which is their heading angle and what we intuitively know about the heading angle rate change of the pedestrian and how quickly they could turn and jump into the road. Now, on the other hand, if the pedestrian is in the road, we might expect that they could move in any direction. So we need to navigate more cautiously. So these are the kinds of assumptions that automated vehicles can make to navigate safely in the world, balancing the need to be safe with also the need to have a useful vehicle at the end of the day. So our call to action then is that industry and government must align on what it means to drive safely. And ultimately, assumptions are at the heart of understanding that balance and that level of acceptable risk that the vehicle should have. Industry needs to finish these standards, and the research community can help us by figuring out different methods for defining and deriving what are these acceptable values that can be used for parameters used in safety models that conform with IEEE 2846. Thank you for your time today.